Welcome back to Uplift. Joining me this week is Dr. Greg Pike, a research fellow at the BIOS Centre, all the way from Adelaide in Australia. Thank you, Dr. Greg, for joining me all the way from Australia today. It's been great to see you in person. So, Dr. Greg, to be clear, what do we mean by euthanasia and assisted suicide, and can you provide definitions?
I think one of the critical parts of any definition is intention. Okay, so euthanasia would be defined typically in terms of lethal injection intended to end life. And we also need to keep in mind that need not necessarily be by one particular drug. So things like insulin can kill people, opioids can kill people even though they're very good painkillers. So that broadens our understanding of how euthanasia can occur. But typically ethicists think of euthanasia in terms of by act or omission. I think we'll just leave that for the moment, but it's worth keeping in mind that there's this whole area of intervention by omission which is intended to end life. And that's part of another broader discussion. But assisted suicide would typically mean that someone would fit certain criteria, then the medical professional would provide a script. They could go to the pharmacy, obtain the poison, and take it home and use it at their own point of decision making, which has its own issues. So assisted suicide, the doctor doesn't actually do the act. The person is responsible for the act, but they've been provided with the means to do it.
So those who advocate for euthanasia and assisted suicide argue that it provides an opportunity for someone to choose a peaceful death rather than to continue their suffering. Is that a reasonable one, do you think?
I think what's reasonable is that people don't want to have a terrible death. That's obvious. So we can certainly understand that there's a lot of suffering or can be a lot of suffering at the end of life, and we recognise that. And the whole business of medicine is directed towards alleviating that suffering. So to want a peaceful death is a fair thing to want. So that's reasonable. But what I don't think is reasonable is that life be cut short intentionally, and there are some big issues here in terms of the role of the state, which is really what we're talking about. Obviously, the state spends a lot of effort trying to minimise the risk of suicide, and we might be able to address that a little later. Yeah.
One of the arguments against euthanasia and assisted suicide is that it's impossible to just regulate it for hard cases. What do you think about that in places where euthanasia and assisted suicide are legal?
Yes, I think there's two responses. One we'll come to in a moment, the places where we got data and we got evidence, because that's been a practice for a long period of time. But I think there's also the principled position, and that's the kind of idea that we want it only for hard cases, and that's how it's promoted. But as soon as you actually make that permissible in law, that the state will take the step to permit its certain citizens to be killed, once you do that, the reason it's really difficult to contain is that we frame that around choice, that it's a legitimate choice. But if a medical professional has before him or her an individual who is suffering and who says, I want euthanasia, but then they later have another patient who is not able to request but seems to be suffering just the same, the logic of it appears to be, well, for this one the only difference is autonomy. Why can't we stretch it to this case? And then we might also say there's a sort of a shift in another direction, that once we've said that we're talking about a free choice to access euthanasia, once we're talking about that free choice, then why does it have to be restricted to a certain sort of suffering, at a certain depth of suffering? And so, to cut to the chase, for other legislation, or other legislatures elsewhere in the world, the Dutch are seriously considering euthanasia for tired of life cases. Okay, there's been a huge petition and a huge movement and very strong support from the public to expand euthanasia for those either in that category tired of life or having had a completed life. So suffering as perceived by the individual. It's not something you can easily measure objectively, and I think that's why you get this expansion in those different directions, and it is so hard to contain.
Yeah, definitely. Some people at the end of their life feel that they are a burden to their loved ones around them. How does this relate to euthanasia and assisted suicide?
There's a couple of responses there. One is that I think there's a problem with some figures in authority having promoted the idea of a duty to die. And there's even one I can think of who's said that you know, if you're demented, you're a waste of resources for the NHS. Now, that notion, you know, people who already feel like they're a burden, and there's plenty of research to show that people feel like they're a burden. They don't need much to tip them over the edge. They have public figures of authority suggesting they are, and I notice in the Scottish bill or the debate leading up to the bill, that the question of money has come to the fore, and I just think that's really surprising, because typically pro-euthanasia activists have avoided studiously any mention of euthanasia as a cost-saving measure. Understandably, it's a bad look, but now that's being talked about a little more openly. And for vulnerable people, and we know from the Oregon data where assisted suicide is permitted, that's one of the reasons that people cite for why they chose assisted suicide, was that they feel like a burden. So I would think that a just society would really say, you know, yes, true, it's burdensome often for both the patient and for the community, but a just society cares for people, and people who, you know, it's not like it's a burden impossible to bear, and it certainly shouldn't be, and where it is, the society has failed. And I think particularly for those of our brothers and sisters who suffer with some sort of disability, you know, that's another whole area where, if you like, the dividing line between trying to prevent suicide in the community and assisting suicide is health and disability. That seems to be what is the difference between the two. We expend all this energy to try and stop people committing suicide, but when it's someone who's a burden or in a healthcare system or disability, there seems to be this subtle shift to providing for them suicide by the state.
Can you explain, please, what continuous deep sedation is and how might it relate to euthanasia?
I'll just preface what I'm about to say about CDS, continuous deep sedation, by another term, palliative sedation. Okay, so the idea of palliative sedation is that in extremely hard cases in palliative care, on some occasions the only option left for you to relieve that person's suffering is to sedate them so that they are no longer aware, and quite often that sedation might last a short period of time, then it's removed and it's given the person enough breathing space, they feel a whole lot better, and things are not as dire as they were before. So that's an entirely legitimate practice. However, it's transformed in this CDS into a streamlined pathway where someone is sedated and food and fluids are removed with the intention that they will die. So that fits within the paradigm of euthanasia by omission. It's like sometimes people say slow euthanasia or passive euthanasia. And it's no less euthanasia, it's just that it's by different means, and this goes back to the question of intention. So the incidence of CDS has risen. Switzerland, I think, is the one of the examples where the figures are quite dramatic increase in the use of CDS. Because it is in that sort of appears to be a somewhat more of a grey area, it might be considered to be more acceptable by some. But it is certainly a form of creeping euthanasia, and my particular concern about that is that if CDS becomes the kind of default position in a society which doesn't have euthanasia formally permitted, lethal injection formally permitted, that could become the sort of de facto means of ending someone's life. And then once we look at those cases and realise that really it's a very unpleasant way to die, even if someone's sedated, there's some very interesting literature on what people may be experiencing whilst sedated. If it is a drawn out, costly, painful for everyone type of process, the family watching this happen, then that can push people into saying, well, it's so much easier if we just use a lethal injection. Yeah. That'll stop that whole horrible business of the long 2 weeks wait without food and fluids, and the person dying, the family hanging around. So that's part of the concern about letting that CDS creep in.
Well, you've talked about the expansion of euthanasia. Can you give me some examples, please, of cases?
Yes, I think the expansion we're talking about could also be described as a category expansion. Okay, so patients of different groups. So we've got the hard case that we've talked about. What might be called the leading edge, if you like, it's a terrible way to put it, but leading edge is dementia, people with dementia, and psychiatric cases. Now, for people with dementia, obviously something like the capacity to consent is a real issue. And so one of the things which Holland permits is an advance directive. So someone could be diagnosed newly with dementia and write down, I'll want to be euthanized when I get to this point. So they're handing over, if you like, their choice to the decision of others to say they've reached that point and then be euthanized. There's one particular case I'm thinking of which shows why this could be really problematic. And I'll back up for a moment and say that most ethicists, and certainly medical professionals would normally think this way, would say that if you're going to consent to something, it's got to be contemporaneous with when the medical treatment happens. In other words, it's got to be, if you're going to consent, it's got to be at the time that you do have that procedure, whatever that procedure is. So here we've got an example of a deferred consent, which already jumps out of that kind of idea of contemporaneous consent. So that's a problem straight away. But in this particular case, which came before the courts, I can't remember if it's Belgium or Holland, I think Belgium, involved someone who'd filled an advance directive, then medical professionals and the family decided that the conditions were reached that euthanasia would be used, and then at the time of wanting to carry it out, the patient resisted. She said, no, I refuse, don't want to do that. And sadly, with the assistance of physical assistance of family, it was carried through. So, that's basically what's the argument there is that someone's made the decision. Sorry, you've made your decision. I don't care what happens now. You've hit those circumstances where it should apply, and sorry, it's going to apply. So it's really a fraught area. I think some other inquiries into euthanasia have ruled out dementia, but it's certainly, I mean, that's an extreme case I've just described, but there are many, many cases in the literature about dementia sufferers receiving euthanasia, and I know that Canada is right on the threshold of doing that. So that's one category expansion, and the other is the psychiatric cases, which are just as troubling, not only in terms of consent, and I think anyone who's really dealt with someone who's really suffering from deep depression or anxiety or other conditions knows that their choices are somewhat constrained, and their ability to comprehend can be somewhat constrained, and to make a legitimate decision about terminating their own life is a really, it's a serious matter, and yet there are an increasing number of psychiatric cases in Holland and Belgium. The numbers are steadily increasing, and again, Canada's on the threshold of considering that. But I think one of the additional difficulties is that we have relatively limited understanding of what leads to mental illness, how to treat it. We're not really good at it as a community, and we know that there are biological reasons behind it. We know also that there are social reasons behind it. So if the community's response to someone who is suffering from a mental torment is to offer them euthanasia, we've failed badly, and not dealt with some of the things which can make all the difference for that person.
So do you think that the day will ever come where it'll be a cultural expectation to accept euthanasia and assisted suicide?
I certainly hope it doesn't, because I think that would be a tragic shift in the way the community operates, if I put it that way. What it would really mean is that anyone who gets to a certain point of vulnerability, maybe a certain level of burden on the community, is basically expected to go. I think there are sufficient reasons to be concerned with what's happening. I do think that there is a deeper potential cause that we haven't really talked about, and that goes to the question of the idea that when people get to a certain state, they are not less than human, but somewhat damaged or deficient, and that doesn't fit the ideal that we like to think of as ourselves. And so this is part of the problem with people with a disability too, that they feel that people look at them and think, well, you're not quite all there, which is a terrible thing. Now, if we start thinking that people getting to that level of ill health or damage, or put it whatever way you want to put it, if we start thinking about that, we better quickly realise that all of us are heading there. And what some might be critical of is likely to be the circumstances they eventually find themselves in at the end of life, and they need to then consider whether they would like to have that feeling hanging around the place that they're no longer welcome.
So if the UK does not legalise euthanasia and assisted suicide, you'll have people probably going over, going abroad for it. Do we not have a responsibility to provide for our own people?
We do. I guess it's what we're deciding to provide. This particular argument does come up a lot, and I think it's actually a deflection, really, of the real issue. So the point is that the UK is a nation, responsible for its citizens, and occasionally some of them are going to go overseas. But that should not be a pressure on the UK just to follow suit. It's got its own values that it wishes to operate by, and we would hope that those values would include caring for its citizens, as the question implies, in ways that don't mean terminating their lives. So I think there ought to be a very strong line taken in the UK that just because something happens elsewhere doesn't mean it needs to happen here too. That's in a sense taking away the sovereignty from the UK to argue that it should just follow elsewhere.
So, Dr. Greg Pike, what would you say to MSPs in Parliament who have to vote on this?
I would ask them to think very carefully about what has happened elsewhere. This cannot be contained to just the hard cases that they might hope it would be contained to. It will spread to vulnerable people, and those in the community who most need to be protected will be put at serious risk of harm.
Thank you, Dr. Greg Pike, for joining me in studio today. It was a pleasure chatting to you, and well done for speaking up for those who are most vulnerable and for the voiceless. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us on Uplift today. Tune in again next week where we'll have more influential guests joining me in studio.